Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the history of the United States. A story that I want you to experience not just as a listener, but as a witness in time. So before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. Whether it's 2 a.m. in a silent room or late evening with city noise outside your window. Because these documented accounts have a strange way of finding people at particular moments. It was the autumn of 1837, and inside the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, the beating heart of the largest slave market in America, the city's wealthiest men were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with cigar smoke, sweat, and anticipation. That night's auction was different. The room's focus was not on the number of human beings to be sold, but on a single woman cataloged as lot number 17. A woman who would soon be spoken of across the French Quarter by another name, the Pearl. She stood about 5'4", with skin described in the auction papers as the color of fresh cream with the slightest hint of coffee, eyes a deep shifting amber that seemed to change with the light, and long, glossy black hair falling in waves down her back. The auctioneer, Thomas Williams, introduced her without drama. But the reaction in the room told its own story, murmurs sliding through the crowd like ripples on the Mississippi. Men who had seen hundreds of auctions suddenly leaning forward as if something sacred or forbidden had been placed on the block. The bidding opened at a price 5 times higher than that of an ordinary house servant. And what followed looked less like a transaction and more like a frenzy, as though these men believed that owning this woman meant owning something beyond flesh, beyond labor, something spiritual, almost supernatural. None of them could have imagined that this sale would become the first page in one of New Orleans' strangest and darkest mysteries. A story that would tangle together powerful families, buried inheritances, whispered rumors, and a chain of disappearances that no one could explain until more than a century later in 1962. Renovators breaking through a wall in the long-abandoned Deloqua mansion on Royal Street discovered a hidden room containing a leather-bound journal, 3 human finger bones, and a portrait of a woman whose beauty, even through cracked paint and faded color, was still almost otherworldly. Her name, they eventually learned, was Elellanena Reynolds, known in her time simply as the Pearl, and this is the beginning of the terrifying truth behind her disappearance in the winter of 1842. To understand what happened to Elellanena Reynolds, you must step into New Orleans exactly as it existed in 1837, a city shaped by contradictions so intense that they bordered on madness. This was not the American South in the simple black and white terms taught in school books. New Orleans was a world unto itself, a place where money, bloodlines, skin tone, secrets, and power formed an intricate web that determined a person's fate more than any law ever could. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the city exploded with wealth, cotton, sugar, river trade, slave markets, ships from Europe, Cuba, Haiti, and the American East Coast arrived daily at the port, carrying fortunes, diseases, aristocrats, fugitives, and human cargo. The streets were alive with the mingling of French, Spanish, Creole, African, Caribbean, and American cultures. And beneath that glittering surface lived a society built entirely on hierarchy and exploitation. Unlike the rest of the South, New Orleans operated under a 3-tiered racial system. At the top were white families, French Creoles, Spanish elites, American plantation owners. At the bottom were the enslaved men, women, and children bought and sold in the very hotel where Elellena's fate was sealed. And between them existed a unique middle class, gens de couleur libres, free people of color. They owned land, ran businesses, built wealth, attended opera houses, and in some cases, owned slaves themselves. In the city, your status wasn't simply black or white your genealogy. Your skin shade, your parentage, and even your facial structure could determine your life. And this fragile system depended on silence, secrets, and carefully maintained appearances. Into this world stepped the pearl dot when Charles Deloqua, wealthy sugar baron whose ancestors had come with the earliest French settlers, placed the winning bid of $7,000. It shocked even hardened traders. That amount could purchase an entire plantation crew. Yet Deloqua didn't take Elellanena to his fields. Instead, he ordered that she be taken to his grand residence on Royal Street and classified not as a slave, but as a ward, a legal distinction so unusual that the notary recorded it in confused handwriting, adding a note that the buyer insisted his wording remain untouched. Servants later recalled that when she arrived at the mansion, she was dressed not in the coarse cloth of the enslaved, but in fine garments. Given a room among the family bedrooms, served meals on porcelain, and spoken to as if she were a fragile guest too delicate for the world. Visitors rarely saw her, and when they did, Charles Deloqua introduced her as a distant cousin France who speaks little English. It was a lie so thin it was almost an insult. But no one dared question it, not openly, 2 weeks after Elellanena arrived. Isabel Deloqua, Charles' wife, abruptly left for her family home in Natchez, taking their 3 young children and leaving behind no explanation. Rumors began immediately. Some said she fled upon discovering her husband's cousin was no cousin at all. Others whispered that she'd been threatened or paid to leave. But the strangest detail was this: she stayed away for 6 months, returning only after the most critical events of the winter had passed. During Isabel's absence, Charles locked down the mansion. He stopped attending social gatherings, refused business meetings, and conducted all communication through his private secretary. At night, neighbors reported lights burning long after midnight and voices echoing through the courtyard. The staff tiptoed from room to room as if living inside a storm. Then, in January 1838, a doctor was summoned. Dr. Samuel Lawrence, a respected physician whose journals still survive in the Tulane University archives, recorded the visit in detail. He wrote that the young woman he saw was suffering from a persistent cough, possibly early-stage consumption, but something about her condition unsettled him. She appeared physically strong, but emotionally haunted. When Charles stepped outside to retrieve a tonic, Dr. Lawrence asked her gently if she needed help, and she whispered, "Do you know anything of my true circumstances before I arrived here?" Before he could answer, Charles returned, and she fell silent. The doctor was never allowed back inside the home. Meanwhile, society gossip spread like wildfire across New Orleans. Who was this woman? Why had a planter paid a fortune for her only to hide her away? Why did she look refined, educated, nothing like the enslaved women typically sold at auction? The rumors grew darker. Some said she was Charles' secret daughter. Others insisted she was his mistress. But the most persistent whisper suggested something else entirely: a connection to the Villars family, one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most secretive lineages in Louisiana. The Villars clan controlled sugar plantations, old war fortunes, and, according to local legend, privateering operations dating back to the War of 1812. Their patriarch, the aging Henry Villars, had been present at the auction the night the pearl was sold and had been one of the fiercest bidders until Deloqua outbid him. Why would an elderly aristocrat compete violently for a woman supposedly brought from Havana? What secret could tie a newly arrived stranger to one of the most powerful families in Louisiana? No one knew then, but the truth would emerge much later, buried in an attic journal, in hidden paintings, in sealed letters, and ultimately an inheritance so scandalous that entire families would destroy records, hide bodies, and vanish across oceans to keep it concealed. And at the center of this storm, this web of bloodlines and deception, stood a woman who had been stripped of her name, her freedom, and her identity, yet who possessed a heritage that could shatter the foundations of New Orleans society. Elellanena Reynolds. The Pearl Dot and her story had only just begun. Elellanen's true nightmare began inside the walls of the Deloqua mansion, where days folded into one another like a slow suffocation. Though she lived in a bedroom meant for family, every hallway she walked, every window she approached, every breath she took reminded her that she was not free. She was being kept. Charles Deloqua treated her with unsettling courtesy, speaking softly, bringing her books, offering fine clothing, but never permitting her to leave, never allowing her any direct contact with the outside world. It was captivity wrapped in silk, and she knew it. Her journal, discovered more than a century later in a hidden room, recorded the first signs of her fear turning into understanding. "He allows me the library," she wrote on March 11th, 1838. "It forbids the courtyard. He says the restrictions are for my protection. From what, he will not say. The mansion's library became her only refuge, a place filled with French novels, legal texts, plantation ledgers, and dusty volumes on family genealogy. In those books, she sought a piece of herself, some explanation for why a wealthy man would purchase her, yet refused to treat her as property or kin. But the answers would come from a living source, not a written one. One April afternoon, Charles brought an elderly visitor into the library. The servants whispered the man's name with a mix of fear and reverence. Henry Villars, patriarch of the Villars family, the very lineage rumored to have ties to the mysterious pearl. Elellanena noticed immediately how the old man's gaze lingered on her face, not with desire, but with desperate recognition, as though he were searching for someone long lost. Henry and Charles spoke in French, believing she couldn't understand. They discussed resemblance, bloodlines, inheritance, and something one of them called la complication. When Charles stepped out briefly, Henry approached her. His voice trembled. "Your mother? Did she ever wear a gold locket with the engraving of a ship?" The question hit her like a blow. Yes, her mother had worn exactly such a locket until the day she died. Henry Villars nodded slowly, a terrible sadness clouding his eyes, as if a truth he had buried decades ago had finally returned to demand payment. When Charles re-entered, Henry fell silent, and the visit ended abruptly. That night, Charles confronted her. He demanded to know exactly what the old man had said. His voice, normally soft, sharpened with a fear she had never heard from him. When she pressed him for answers about her past, about her mother, about why Henry Villars seemed to know her, he snapped, warning her that without free papers she had no identity but the one he gave her. And with that, he ordered her kept under a closer watch. Within days, Elellanenna's suspicion solidified into a chilling realization. Charles Deloqua never intended to free her. He intended to hide her. In April, she wrote, "I believe now the story of my papers being processed is a fiction. I am being kept here because of something in my past, something that threatens powerful men." By May, she began to see patterns. The mansion staff spoke of strange visitors arriving at dawn or late at night. She overheard arguments behind closed doors, Charles insisting that nothing must surface, an unnamed man responding that the girl's very existence is a danger. These whispers, combined with the old patriarch's trembling recognition, convinced her that her heritage, not her beauty, not her labor, was the reason she had been seized. Then came the moment that shattered any illusions. She still held, on July 17th, 1838. She managed to slip a message to a sympathetic housemaid, a plea for help to the American consul's office. Her mother had always said she was born free in Philadelphia, not enslaved. If the consul could verify her birth, even the Deloquas couldn't legally hold her. But the maid betrayed her. She took the letter straight to Charles. Her journal entry for August 2nd was only 5 words. It was a trap. "Tomorrow I am to be moved. Moved away from the city, away from witnesses, away from any chance of rescue." And she was right out at dawn. Charles Deloqua transported her to his plantation, Beau Refuge, 50 miles downriver, a place notorious among enslaved people for punishments carried out beyond the oversight of city law. There, isolated between cane fields and the muddy Mississippi, Elellanena was placed under watch in the old overseer's house. A woman named Martha was assigned to attend her. Though Elellanena understood immediately that Martha's real purpose was surveillance, Charles visited her once and only once, delivering a threat so cold it turned her blood to ice. Any further attempts at rebellion, and you will be reclassified as a field hand. Those words meant torture, death, erasure. But what terrified her more was the discovery that Bow Refuge was not just a prison, it was the place where the truth about her past was being buried. Here, away from the city's eyes, she began to hear new bits of information. Conversations cut short when she entered a room. Sudden silences when her name was mentioned. References to the Villars inheritance, verification problems, and a marriage document no one could seem to locate. Martha, when questioned, turned pale and refused to speak. What did the Villars family know about her? Why did they fear her? And why had an old man looked at her as though she were the ghost of someone he had once loved? The pearl had been hidden, but the truth was rising, and soon the forces that had brought her to Bow Refuge would collide with a new, unexpected character, someone whose appearance would turn Elellena's captivity into the first chapter of a much greater war. Bow Refuge was not simply a plantation. It was a fortress of silence, a place where the wealth of the Deloqua family was extracted through violence, secrecy, and fear. Elellanena lived in the old overseer's house, separated from the enslaved workers, separated from the main residence, and separated from every path that led back to freedom. The days were humid, the nights filled with the cries of people being punished in the fields, and the river's constant murmur reminded her that escape might be possible, but only if she understood why she had been brought here. Weeks passed under strict surveillance. Martha slept near her door. 2 field hands stood guard at night. The plantation manager carried a pistol every time he visited her room. And though Elellanena was isolated, Bow Refuge whispered its secrets to her with every passing day. Then, in October 1838, a stranger arrived. His name was Joseph Miller. Introduced to the plantation staff as a northern doctor studying tropical illnesses among enslaved populations. He wore spectacles, carried a medical satchel, and spoke in the calm, slow tone of a man who wished never to offend. But Elellanena later learned he was something far more dangerous than a doctor, an abolitionist infiltrator from Boston, part of a covert network that investigated illegal enslavement cases across the South. He had heard rumors of a young woman on a Louisiana plantation who claimed to have been born free in Philadelphia. A woman whose story made no sense. A woman whose appearance and intelligence and sudden disappearance from New Orleans society had reached the ears of abolitionists searching for lost free citizens. Miller visited Bow Refuge under the pretense of medical inspection, and though the plantation manager watched him closely, there was no guarding a man who knew how to move through suspicion like water. He found a way to speak with Elellanena alone. His encoded letters, decades later, revealed their brief conversation. She has reason to believe her imprisonment is tied not to ordinary trafficking, but to a matter of inheritance and identity. Even he, who had seen horrors throughout the South, wrote that Elellena's case was unlike any I've encountered. She is not being punished. She is being hidden. She told him everything. Her arrival from Havana, Bennett's death, the auction, Charles' strange obsession, the visit from Henry Villars, the hints of bloodlines and lost parentage. She held on to this one hope. My mother's story, my birth in Philadelphia, there must be records, proof, something. Miller listened carefully. He would go north. He would search for proof of her birth. He would return, but he never could. In November 1838, his true identity was discovered. A mob gathered, and Miller fled Louisiana with only minutes to spare, smuggled out by riverboat under false papers. Elellanena never saw him again, yet his escape worsened her situation. Someone at Bow Refuge, perhaps the plantation manager, perhaps Charles Deloqua himself, realized something terrifying. If abolitionists knew about her, others might be searching too. Her confinement tightened. Windows were nailed shut. Martha became more fearful, refusing to speak at all. Servants looked at Elellanena with a mixture of pity and dread, as if she were a living omen. Winter descended. The cane fields lay dormant. Bow Refuge grew colder, darker, more oppressive. Her journal entries from late 1838 into 1839 became infrequent, and the manager spoke of the Villars' inheritance today. They fell silent when they saw me. Why am I connected to that family? Why does my mother's memory frighten them? Something in my blood terrifies these men. And then, without warning, the story erupted into a new and dangerous direction. On February 26, 1839, Henry Villars himself, elderly, frail, nearly carried by time, arrived at Bow Refuge alone. This was unheard of. A man of his wealth never traveled unaccompanied. His arrival was a message in itself. He demanded to see Elellanena privately. His questions were direct. About her mother, about a ship engraved on a gold locket, about a man she had never known, her father. When she told him everything her mother had said, the old man made a sound between a laugh and a sob, and then he gave her the sentence that changed everything. Your mother was a prudent woman, but perhaps too prudent for your own good. No explanation. No confirmation. No proof. Just a trembling voice carrying truth and regret. He promised to return. He never did. 3 days later, Henry Villars was found dead in his study. And with his death, Elellenena's captivity took on a new meaning, a far more dangerous one. Because in Louisiana, when a patriarch died without a male heir, a legal hurricane followed. Inheritance, battles, contested wills, and the sudden need to silence anyone who might hold a claim. Now, the whispers around her sharpened into something unmistakable. Men were not hiding her. Men were hiding what she meant, what her existence threatened, what her bloodline could legally unlock. A fortune, a scandal, a shift in racial and social order so explosive that entire families were willing to bury the truth by burying her. Bow Refuge was no longer a prison. It was a waiting room for something far darker, and the storm was coming. Death of Henry Villars shattered whatever fragile balance had existed in Elellenena's captivity. Bow Refuge changed overnight. The plantation manager became tense. Servants whispered in corners. Martha stopped meeting Elellenena's eyes altogether. Something dreadful was shifting beneath the surface of the Deloqua world, something rooted in inheritance, blood, and secrets that had been buried for decades. And Elellanena understood one thing with cold certainty. Henry Villars had recognized her, recognized something in her face, recognized something about her mother, recognized a truth he had carried into the grave. His death triggered a legal battle across Louisiana. With no male heir, the Villars estate, one of the wealthiest in the region, fell into dispute. The only surviving male relative was a nephew, Louis Villars, who immediately filed a claim. But whispers began to surface among lawyers and old Creole families. What if Henry had another descendant? What if there existed a child no one had acknowledged? What if that child was the woman the Deloquas were hiding? Inside Bow Refuge, Elellanena began to piece together the truth from stray sentences, hushed arguments, and journal entries growing more frantic by the day. On April 9th, 1839, she wrote, "She arrived today in a state of great agitation, demanding to know exactly what the old man had said. He searched my room, my clothes, even my mother's Bible. When he left, he carried away my birth, papers, her last proof of freedom gone. But that wasn't what frightened her. What frightened her was the realization that everyone around her seemed to know more about her parents than she did. To the servants. She wrote, 'Who was my father?' They refused to answer. To Martha, 'What do the Villars want with me?' Martha went pale, backed away, and whispered, 'Child, some bloodlines are dangerous. Leave it alone.' Yet Elellanena could not leave it alone. She remembered her mother's stories of Philadelphia, of a French merchant who had loved her deeply, of a marriage that was never spoken of openly. She remembered the gold locket with the ship engraving. She remembered her mother saying, "You must never go south. Never let them know who you are." Now she understood why. She wasn't a slave by birth. She wasn't even a servant. She wasn't foreign. She was a Villars, the daughter, possibly the legitimate daughter of young Baptiste Villars, Henry's estranged son who had supposedly died at sea. If her parents had indeed married, she was the rightful heir to a large portion of the Villars' fortune under Louisiana's hybrid French inheritance laws. Her existence threatened to explode. The entire social structure, a woman with African ancestry, a woman sold on an auction block, a woman the law considered property, could legally inherit a white Creole fortune in New Orleans society. This was unthinkable. It was also legal. And that made Elellanena the most dangerous woman in Louisiana. Her journal reflected the moment she fully understood the stakes. I was not brought here to be owned. I was brought here to be erased. As the inheritance case intensified in New Orleans courts, Charles Deloqua's behavior spiraled. He visited Beau Refuge frequently, always in agitation, always demanding to know what Henry Villars had confided in her. Elellanena noted the fear in his voice, the terror of financial ruin and scandal. Beau Refuge was heavily indebted. Charles' finances were failing. If Henry Villars owed him money, or if secret business dealings existed between them, the revelation of Elellanena identity could destroy him. He was desperate, which meant Elellanena was no longer just property. She was a liability, a threat, a person who possessed knowledge in blood worth killing for by June 1839. She recorded her darkest entry at, "I see now that my father was not a French merchant, but a Villars. And if documentation of their marriage exists, it would explain everything. I am being hidden to protect men who have built fortunes upon lies." Beau Refuge became her cage. The river became her boundary. Every footstep outside her door felt like it carried a death sentence. But she refused to die quietly. She watched. She listened. She planned. Then, on September 3rd, 1839, her journal documented the turning point. "I have found a way. The riverboat stops here tomorrow. Martha will help me in exchange for my mother's earrings. If all goes well, I shall reach New Orleans by nightfall, and then north. I must find those papers before it's too late." These were her last written words. The next day, plantation records show that a female slave matching her description disappeared. A reward was issued. Search parties were sent north, but Elellanena had moved south, back toward New Orleans, back toward the Deloqua mansion, back toward the documents that could prove she was not property yet. She wasn't fleeing, she was going back for the truth, and New Orleans was about to face the consequences of everything it had tried to bury. Elellanena escape in September 1839 marked the end of her life as a captive, but it was only the beginning of her life as a phantom. After slipping away from Beau Refuge, she didn't head north like Charles Deloqua expected. Instead, she moved silently back toward New Orleans, toward the very city that had tried to erase her. She knew what she needed: proof. Proof of her mother, proof of her birth, proof of her father, proof that she was not a slave, but a Villars. Proof powerful enough to topple a dynasty. For nearly 3 years, the records fall silent. Elellanena Reynolds disappeared from all documentation. No plantation logs, no ship manifests, no arrests, no deaths, nothing. But 3 pieces of evidence suggest exactly where she went and how she survived. 1. The apothecary receipt, a signature in the shadows, a receipt dated September 7th, 1839, discovered in an old French Quarter pharmacy, recorded the purchase of women's toiletries. But the purchase wasn't made in Elellanena''s name. Instead, it was charged to Marie Laveau, The legendary voodoo priestess who ruled the shadows of New Orleans, Laveau was known to shelter fugitives, known to hide people from slave catchers, known to manipulate the city's elite. Through fear and rumor dot if anyone could hide a woman hunted by two of the richest families in Louisiana. It was Marie Laveau, and hiding her wasn't all. Laveau was also known for securing documents, letters, papers, and proof that others wanted destroyed. 2. The Deloqua mansion. The quiet intruder historians believe Elellanena slipped back into the Deloqua mansion, at least once likely at night, with help from someone inside the household. Charles had taken her mother's Bible, her letters, her birth certificate. Those records were only hope, but something else happened inside that house, something that wouldn't be uncovered. Until 1962, when workers broke into a sealed room and found a journal, a portrait, and 3 human finger bones dot inside that room decades earlier. Something terrible had unfolded, something connected to Elellanena.3, the letters of Margaret Wilson, the lost confession in 1958. An elderly woman claiming to be Elellenena's great-granddaughter arrived in New Orleans with a bundle of letters supposedly written by Elellanena in London. These letters described her missing years. I lived under the protection of a woman feared and loved by the city. She taught me to vanish in plain sight. That woman, almost certainly Marie Laveau, ensured Elellenena's survival and likely assisted her in retrieving documents tied to Vilar's inheritance. The letters also suggested something darker. I know what he intends to do if they try to reclaim me, and I cannot say he is wrong to consider such measures. He was almost certainly Louis Vilar's. Her reappearance shocks the city after nearly 3 years of silence. New Orleans society was caught off guard by an event so bold it bordered on impossible. On January 1842, at the annual Mardi Gras ball, held at the St. Louis Hotel, the very building where she had been sold like property only 5 years earlier, Elellanena walked in wearing a gown of deep midnight blue silk, and she did. Not walking alone. She walked beside Louis Villars, heir to the Villars fortune, nephew of Henry Villars, and the man whose existence had overshadowed her life since birth. Witnesses reported that the ballroom froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. The orchestra faltered. Society matrons stared in horror. Young men stared in awe. Old Creole families exchanged glances filled with panic. A woman they believed dead, enslaved, or vanished had returned as the honored companion of the heir to the Villars dynasty. That every whisper that night carried the same message: the pearl has returned. And standing at the edge of the room, face drained of color, trembling with disbelief and rage, was Charles Deloqua. Those who witnessed the moment said he looked as though he had seen a ghost. He tried to approach Elellanena shouting, pleading, but Louis men intercepted him. He left the ballroom shaking, escorted by friends who feared he might collapse. The next morning, he filed a legal complaint accusing Louis Villars of stealing property belonging to the Deloqua estate. Within 24 hours, the complaint was withdrawn. No explanation. No follow-up. No appeal. Everyone understood the truth. Charles had been warned. And the warning had come from someone powerful enough to silence him instantly. Departure and disaster in February 12, 1842, Elellanena and Louis boarded a steamship bound for France. Passenger logs listed her not as his servant nor as his mistress, but as his ward, a strategic term that kept questions at bay. They left New Orleans behind, but Louisiana was not finished paying for what it had done. 15 days later, the Deloqua family vanishes on February 27th. Neighbors noticed lights burning all night inside the once quiet Deloqua mansion. Servants carried heavy trunks to waiting carriages. Doors slammed. Voices shouted. And then dashed silence stopped by morning. The mansion was empty. Clothes still hung in wardrobes. Food still sat on plates. Beds were still warm. Candles were still burning. The Deloquas were gone. 2 weeks later, The bodies of Deloqua's secretary and his plantation manager were found in the swamp's execution-style shots to the head. Police opened an investigation. It closed in less than 4 months. Too many people refused to talk. Too many wealthy families were involved. Too many secrets were at stake. The city's collective conclusion: everyone understood what had happened. They just never spoke it aloud. The Pearl had escaped. The Villars area had protected her. The Deloqua family had tried to stop them. And someone with money, influence, and desperate loyalty made sure they could never try again. Chapter 6 ends with the city holding its breath. A powerful family erased. A woman reborn. And the stage set for the darkest revelations yet to come. For more than a century, the disappearance of the Deloqua family remained an open wound in New Orleans folklore ghost story. Part scandal, part whispered warning about the consequences of crossing the wrong people. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the city for what workers discovered in 1962, when the abandoned Deloqua mansion on Royal Street underwent restoration. Behind a cracked section of plaster, carpenters found a false wall. Behind that wall, they found a door with no lock, only hinges rusted by time. And behind the door, they found a room no one had entered in over 100 years. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and secrets. But everything inside was untouched, preserved, waiting. The discovery would reopen a case that had haunted the city since. 1842. The journal, a voice that returned. From the dead on a small wooden table lay a leather-bound journal. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, unmistakably educated. It belonged to Elellanena Reynolds herself. Her entries ended the night before her escape from Bow Refuge. Her words were the final moments before she reclaimed her life. Her journal was the missing testimony that had never made it to court, to newspapers, to any official inquiry. In it were details that matched plantation logs, doctors' notes, shipping records, and oral histories. It proved she had been hidden, silenced, stripped of her papers, and nearly erased. But the journal was only the beginning. The 3 finger bones, a gruesome silence. Preserved in a small wooden box lined with decayed velvet, lay 3 human finger bones. The bones were male. The estimated death occurred around 1842. The manner of removal suggested violence, clean cuts, not decay. The preservation indicated someone had kept them intentionally. In 2002. DNA testing confirmed a faint genetic match to remains later identified as Charles Deloqua's relatives. The finger bones were almost certainly his. Someone, whether Elellanena, Louis Villars, or one of their hired men, had kept part of his body as evidence, leverage, or symbol. The hidden room was not simply storage. It was a reliquary of justice by other means. A port, beauty painted over truth. The most astonishing object in the room hung on the far wall, a large portrait of Elellanena, dressed in the deep blue gown she had worn to the Mardi Gras ball in 1842. Her face was serene, almost regal. Her amber eyes glowed. Her expression held quiet defiance, as if challenging the viewer to deny her humanity ever again. But here was the mystery. When art conservators X-rayed the canvas in 1975, they found another painting beneath the surface, a family portrait. The subjects, Jean-Baptiste Villars, his wife Marie Reynolds, and a baby girl. The baby had Elellena's eyes. It was a portrait of her birth family. Almost certainly Elellanena herself had painted her own image over the old portrait. Why? 2 reasons emerged: to hide the original painting, which proved her Villars bloodline; to reclaim the space, literally painting her identity over the erasure attempted by the Deloquas. Her past concealed, her future declared, her inheritance symbolically reclaimed. This single object carried more truth than any legal document ever could. Louis Villars. Confession, the final piece of the puzzle. Final shot came not from the hidden room but from the Villars estate itself. In 1994. During a study of the family's old plantation home, archivists found a sealed compartment within a fireplace mantel. Inside was a parchment wrapped in O-I-L-L-O-T-H dot. It was a confession signed by Louis Villars, dated February 25th, 1842, 2 days before the Deloqua Spanish diet. He wrote, "The elimination of Charles and Isabel Deloqua has become necessary for her safety and for our future. Their claims would follow us to Europe. The children will be removed beforehand at her insistence. The men engaged for the task understand the consequences of failure or betrayal. The bodies will never be found." This confession answered every question the city had debated for 150 years. Louis Villars had hired men to kill Charles and Isabel Deloqua. He had arranged protection for the Deloqua children. He had removed witnesses. He had secured Elellanenna's freedom at any cost. He hadn't acted out of madness, jealousy, or greed. He acted because the law offered Elellanena no justice. Only violence could protect her from a system built entirely to destroy her. It was wrong. It was murder. It was also the only path to her survival. The truth behind the Villars settlement. The Villars family later claimed Elellanena as kin. They acknowledged her. They apologized. They established scholarships in her name. But these gestures came more than a century too late. The documents revealed that Louis had discovered her father's marriage was real. Her birth was legitimate. Her claim to the Villars' inheritance was lawful. The family estate would have legally passed to her. Had this been exposed in 1839, Louisiana society would have exploded. A woman of African ancestry, a woman sold at auction, would have outranked the most powerful Creole families that could not be allowed. So the men who governed knew. Orleans chose silence. Louis Villars chose justice. And Elellanena chose survival. What the room truly represented, historians now believe the hidden room was created by the Deloquas themselves, placed to conceal evidence before fleeing or destroying it. But when Louis hired men entered the mansion, they didn't destroy anything. They sealed the room instead. They left the evidence. They let the truth sleep. They ensured that one day, long after everyone involved was dead, the city would finally be forced to face what it had done. The hidden room wasn't a crime scene. It was a confession hall built by those who sought silence, preserved by those who sought truth. And in that room, frozen in time, was the story of a woman who fought an empire and won. But the darkest chapter, the fate of the Deloqua children, the river discovery, and the final years of Elellanenna's life was still to come. The disappearance of the Deloqua family in 1842 should have ended like so many tragedies of the Antebellum South with silence. But history, especially in New Orleans, never stays buried forever. Like the river that shaped the city, truth rises when the current changes. And over the next century and a half, fragments of the Pearl's story kept rising bone by bone, letter by letter, shadow by shadow, until the full shape of her fate finally emerged. The lost children. Mercy in the dark for more than a century. The greatest mystery of the Deloqua case was not the death of Charles and Isabel. It was the fate of their 3 young children. Rumors said they drowned. Rumors said they were smuggled north. Rumors said they were killed alongside their parents. But in 1976, a breakthrough came. A researcher named Thomas Lawrence discovered a shipping manifest from March 1842 documenting 3 children, unaccompanied, traveling from New Orleans to Havana. Surname, Reynolds. Guardian, Martha Bernard. Martha, the same woman assigned to watch Elellanena at Bow Refuge. The same woman Elellanena had trusted with her life. This record confirmed 2 things. The children were not murdered. Elellanena herself insisted they be spared. Years later, her letters from London, brought by the mysterious Margaret Wilson, contained a chilling line. "El promises the children were sent away before the night's events. I pray it is true, though I may never know." She carried their survival like a ghost on her conscience, After arriving in Havana, the children vanished from official records, absorbed into Cuban society under new names. Protected by free people of color in a community where bloodlines meant little and secrecy meant survival, they lived. But they would never know who they were, or what became of their parents, or why they were forced to vanish. The river gives up its dead. The Deloqua was finally found in 1981. A severe Mississippi drought brought the river to its lowest level in decades. Fishermen began finding debris from the 1800s along newly exposed RAVE, RBE, S. And then they found the boat, a flat-bottomed vessel, rotted wood, iron chains. Human remains. Inside were 4 bodies, a grown man, a grown woman, 2 adult males. All 4 had been killed the same way. A single gunshot through the skull, execution style. Forensic examination matched approximate ages and dates. 2. Charles Deloqua, Isabel Deloqua. The private secretary, the plantation manager, personal items confirmed the identification. A pocket watch, engraved CD, a woman's locket containing miniatures of 3 children. Fragments of clothing typical of wealthy Creole families. The boat had been scuttled. Weighted down. Sunk in deep water. Never meant to be found. This discovery proved what letters, rumors, and whispers had long suggested. The Deloquas were executed, not disappeared. Their killers were professionals. And the order came from someone with deep pockets and powerful motives. And only one man fitted that description. Louis Villars. Louis. Confession. Justice by other means when the sealed confession signed by Lewis in 1994. Every unanswered question finally aligned. He admitted. He hired men to kill Charles and Isabel. He removed the Deloqua children beforehand at Elellanena insistence. He eliminated the secretary and plantation manager as witnesses. He arranged the disposal of the bodies. He financed their flight to Cuba. He ensured that the truth would only appear after his death. His closing line burned through history. What I have done for her freedom, which no law here would ever grant. Louis Villars became judge, jury, and executioner, not because he enjoyed violence, but because the legal world of 1840s New Orleans gave no protection to a woman of mixed race claiming her rightful legacy. In that world, a stolen identity could be restored only by stolen justice. London. The Pearls' final life, Elellanena and Louis built a new life in Europe, first in France, then settling in London. Census records show they lived comfortably, quietly, and respectably. They had 3 children who grew never knowing their mother's past or her scars. In 1872, Elellanena died at age 55. Louis died 6 years later, when tested in 2002. DNA from her London grave matched DNA from the finger bones in the hidden room. The message was unmistakable. Her past followed her across oceans, and she chose to leave a piece of it behind. What remains unknown. The ghost's history refuses to silence. Some questions will never be answered. Did Elellanena witness the execution of the Deloquas? Did she watch the river swallow their bodies? Did she approve? Did she regret? Did she know the children survived? Did she know her father was indeed Jean-Baptiste Villars? Did she paint her portrait over her family's image as a symbol of rebirth or defiance? History can only speculate, but her portrait, The Pearl, still hangs in the historic New Orleans collection. Visitors say her amber eyes follow them. Not with fear, not with sorrow, but with something sharper, the look of a woman who wrote her own identity into existence. The final truth of her story is more than a tale of slavery and escape. More than inheritance and murder, more than scandal and blood. It is the story of a woman born free, enslaved by fraud, hidden for her lineage, hunted for her blood, saved by her courage, avenged by a man who loved her, remembered by a world that tried to forget her. Elellanena Reynolds, the Pearl, did not just survive the system that tried to destroy her. She defeated it. And she changed the legacy of the families who sought to own or erase her dot in the hidden room of a haunted house. In the bones lifted from a riverbed, in confessions carved into old paper, in the footsteps heard on quiet nights, her story still moves. And as long as her portrait watches from its museum wall, the city that once sold her will never forget her again,